In 1996, school bus driver Carl Decker vanished without a trace while driving an empty bus back from a late drop-off on a foggy October afternoon. No students were on board, no signs of a crash. The bus and Carl were never found until nearly 3 decades later when receding floodwaters uncovered twisted yellow metal in a forgotten ravine. What investigators found inside unraveled a much older secret buried by more than just mud and time. The fog clung low over the cornfields of Pine Hollow, like a heavy quilt muting the late October afternoon light. Carl Decker pulled the worn yellow school bus onto County Route 17, his gloved hands steady on the oversized steering wheel. He'd completed nearly all of his route. The kids had already disembarked their backpacks, bouncing as they disappeared into driveways, porches, and creaky screen doors. All but one. Timmy Lasker, a second grader with oversized glasses and a silence that unnerved some of the more boisterous kids, still sat quietly near the front. Carl had one last stop to make up past a steep rise and along a wooded stretch that curved beside what locals called Slaughter Creek. It wasn't on any official map anymore. The Army Corps of Engineers had rerouted parts of the channel in the 80s, and the old bridges had either collapsed or been replaced by culverts. But Carl knew the back roads. He'd driven this route for 15 years. He knew every pothole and each fence line. Almost home, Timmy Carl said, his voice even practiced. Timmy didn't reply, just gave a slight nod, hugging his knees to his chest. The boy's house sat about half a mile down a gravel turnoff that looked like it belonged in another century. Carl signaled, though there was no one around to see, and turned. The gravel crunched under the tires as the trees drew in closer, forming a tunnel of orange, yellow, and brown. That was the last confirmed sighting of Carl Decker. When Timmy's mother called the school district an hour later, asking why her son hadn't been dropped off, it triggered a routine call to the dispatcher. The dispatcher tried the bus radio, no answer. Maybe Carl had broken down. Maybe he'd gone to get help. These things happened in rural Missouri. By nightfall, concern had turned to panic. It wasn't just Carl missing. The bus was gone too. Entirely. Deputies drove the full route. Local farmers were called. Helicopters circled overhead, using spotlights to scan fields and forests. The creek, already swollen from recent rains, was probed with poles and flashlights, but nothing turned up. Even the tracking dogs brought in from Springfield caught no scent. It didn't make sense. A 30-foot bright yellow bus doesn't just vanish. Not in Pine Hollow. Not on roads people had driven since the 1940s. Sheriff Lena Bowden stood at the side of the creek that night, watching the mist roll off the water. "If it's in there," she murmured to her deputy, "we'll find it." But they didn't. Not that night. Not that week. Not that year. Timmy Lasker, who had eventually been found walking alone along Old Quarry Road, said he didn't remember much. He told his mother he had fallen asleep and woke up alone, crawling out of the bus, scared and crying. But he didn't know where Carl had gone. He couldn't describe where the bus had been. Just trees and water. The official report was maddeningly vague: driver missing, student recovered unharmed, vehicle not located. Rumors took over where the facts failed. Some said Carl had run off, though no one could explain why he'd do it in a bus. Others whispered about the nearby penitentiary. Maybe an escapee had hijacked the vehicle. But no one had escaped. Some believed the fog had been cover for something sinister. Drugs. Moonshine. Something involving the Lasker family. None of it stuck. None of it led anywhere. By 2000, the case had gone cold. By 2010, it had become a cautionary tale. The town changed. The kids who once rode Carl's bus grew up, moved on. The Laskers left Missouri entirely in 2004. New families came to Pine Hollow, new drivers, new buses. But in the archives of the Pine Hollow Gazette, yellowing in the library basement, one headline always stood out: Bus driver vanishes, no sign of vehicle, child found miles from route. And beneath it, a single grainy photo, Carl Decker, in a short-sleeved button-down, his thinning hair swept to the side, standing in front of bus No. 14 with a tired but genuine smile. It would be another 27 years before someone would see that bus again. And by then it would be far too late to ask Carl what happened that day. By the time winter crept into Pine Hollow in late 1996, the town had stopped talking about Carl Decker. Not because they'd forgotten, no one could forget something like that, but because silence was easier than admitting nothing had been found. Even Timmy Lasker, who'd once been the center of every rumor, was left alone as the community quietly filed the whole event under tragedy and moved on. The investigation had turned up nothing but dead ends. Sheriff Bowden coordinated with state troopers and even brought in a sonar team to sweep parts of Slaughter Creek, though the technology at the time was crude and unreliable in shallow, rocky waterways. Weeks passed with no developments. Carl's wife, Judith, was left with more questions than answers. His keys, wallet, and jacket were all missing, assumed to be with him on the bus. But the house showed no signs of preparation for a disappearance. No hidden money, no notes, no open tabs. In fact, everything about Carl's life screamed stability. He was reliable. A quiet man who spent his off hours fixing his lawnmower or watching old westerns. He'd never been in trouble, never missed a day of work. He didn't drink, didn't even curse. The idea that he'd simply driven the bus into the woods and vanished on purpose made no sense. Yet law enforcement had no other theory. In early 1997, the case was formally classified as inactive, unresolved. The bus was presumed lost to the terrain, perhaps washed away in one of the region's flash floods. Carl, by extension, was presumed dead. A memorial service was held at Trinity Church. A small plaque bearing his name was bolted to the brick wall outside the school. Timmy Lasker, still only 8, said nothing else about the ride. He was the only person alive who had last seen Carl Decker. Years trickled by. The route Carl drove was restructured. New asphalt went down over some of the gravel paths. Others were closed off after private landowners rezoned property. A new bridge was built half a mile west of Slaughter Creek. And when that happened, the old crooked dirt turnoff Carl had taken in 1996 was overgrown and forgotten. By 2008, you could barely spot where it had been. Saplings now stood where the bus once might have passed, and still nothing turned up. But even long-buried stories have a way of clawing their way back to the surface. In the summer of 2023, Pine Hollow was hit with record rains. The storm system that stalled over the region for 4 days straight dumped nearly 15 inches, overwhelming the creeks and forcing evacuations from low-lying farms. Slaughter Creek flooded its banks and carved a new path through a neighboring cattle field. Debris filled the ditches, tree limbs, broken fence posts, and rusted scrap the floods churned from the old hollows. By early August, the waters receded, leaving behind silty mud and jagged erosion scars. It was during this time that Carl's bus revealed itself. A teenager named Mason Wright, out filming drone footage for his YouTube channel, spotted something strange glinting through the trees near a sinkhole on his uncle's property. Zooming in, he could see a curved shape. Yellow, maybe metal. His drone camera circled. Something didn't belong in the middle of that clearing. When he hiked down the next morning, boots sticking in swampy soil, he found it. Half buried under layers of mud silt and tree roots was the roof of a school bus. Rusted, bent, but unmistakable. The sheriff's office was notified immediately. By the afternoon, the clearing was taped off, and local news cameras had set up at the roadside. The town buzzed with one question. Could it be Carl's bus? Sheriff Marta Quinn, who'd inherited the position after Bowden retired in 2011, stood at the edge of the ravine with a field tablet in hand. She'd been in high school when Carl Decker vanished. She remembered the fog. She remembered the fear. Now she was about to dig up the very bus they'd all sworn was gone for good. Excavation was slow. They brought in archaeologists and recovery specialists to carefully extract the wreck without disturbing potential evidence. What remained of the bus lay twisted on its right side, jammed between the roots of two massive sycamores. The windows were shattered. The door was wedged open. One tire still clung to the axle, flattened and warped. And inside, half buried in clay and flood debris, were human remains. A forensic anthropologist confirmed it within hours. Adult male, skeletal, seated in the driver's chair. Remnants of a polyester uniform shirt still clung to the bones. The name patch, bleached by years of water and decay, was barely legible, but it was enough. Carl. They found his wallet under the seat. Leather-wrapped, miraculously preserved. It contained his ID, a few faded bills, and a rusted keyring. Sheriff Quinn stared at the old driver's license photo. It was him. After 27 years, they had found Carl Decker. But the case was far from over. Because also buried in the debris just under the bus floorboards near the rear were several items wrapped in plastic sheeting and sealed with duct tape. When the evidence team opened them, they found a bundle of small canvas bags, each one marked First National Bank, Mount View. Inside were stacks of moldy, crumbling $100 bills. And that changed everything. The news spread like wildfire. Within 24 hours of the bus's discovery, Pine Hollow was swarmed with media vans, crime podcasters, and state investigators who hadn't set foot in the town since the 90s. A press conference held by Sheriff Quinn confirmed what many already feared, and some had quietly hoped would never be unearthed. The body inside the bus was conclusively identified as Carl Decker through dental records and DNA swabbed from a preserved molar. The state crime lab corroborated it with samples from Carl's surviving cousin in Iowa. There was no longer any doubt. Carl hadn't vanished. He'd died in that bus. But what raised more eyebrows and questions wasn't just the discovery of the vehicle, or even Carl's bones. It was the bank bags. Waterlogged and brittle, the canvas sacks bore the faint red imprint of a Mount View bank logo that had been retired in the early 1980s. The bills inside, most damaged beyond use, were old-style hundreds, all bearing print dates from the late 1970s through the early 90s. Nearly all had serial numbers that traced back to a specific bank heist in 1992 that had never been solved. Sheriff Quinn had to read that report twice to believe it. 4 years before Carl's disappearance, an armored truck en route to Springfield was robbed on a Forest Service road by what authorities believed were at least 2 armed suspects. The vehicle was found torched and abandoned 40 miles from the highway. Over $480,000 had been stolen. None of it had ever been recovered, until now. Recovered from beneath the bus were 8 bags, 6 full of decayed cash, 2 still relatively intact. The serial number range on the preserved bills matched the heist exactly. Even more chilling, each sack had been lined in a way that suggested deliberate long-term storage, waterproof wrapping, vacuum-sealed food-grade plastic silica packets, and tar paper wrap, almost professional in quality. Carl Decker's widow Judith was summoned back to town. She arrived looking worn by time and grief. Her hair now silver, her eyes ringed with disbelief, she faced Sheriff Quinn in the station's back room. Her hands trembled as she sifted through Carl's recovered possessions. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This doesn't make sense. Carl didn't have money. We had savings, but not this. We barely paid off the roof. Did he ever mention anything about a bank job or having contact with anyone from Mount View?" Sheriff Quinn asked gently. Judith gave her a look that hovered somewhere between confusion and outrage. "Carl Decker couldn't even lie about forgetting to take out the trash," she said. "The man was too honest for his own good. He wouldn't have stolen a newspaper from a diner." The contradiction was stark. On paper, Carl was a quiet, decent man, a model employee. He'd never had so much as a parking ticket. His bank records from the months before his disappearance showed no large deposits, no extravagant purchases, no second home. If he was involved in a heist, he'd hidden it so deeply that no one, including his own wife, had any idea. Which begged the question, if Carl hadn't stolen the money, why was it under his bus, and why had he ended up dead with it? That same week, Quinn received a call from FBI Special Agent Royce Hammond, who had worked the original armored truck case in '92 and had since retired. Now living in Tucson, Hammond had kept a copy of the case file. "I remember Decker," Hammond said. "He came up in the early stages, lived near the drop-off point where we found the armored truck. Had a cousin who worked maintenance at the Mount View depot." Quinn blinked. Why wasn't he pursued then? Because we interviewed him. No record, no motive. And he was, well, boring. Checked out completely. He alibied himself with 2 co-workers and his wife. So we let him go. Now, with Carl's body discovered, the story didn't feel so boring anymore. The deeper they dug, the more tangled the story became. The mechanic who had alibied Carl back in 1992 dead in 2004. The cousin at the bank depot moved to Florida and died in a boating accident in 2016. Everyone who could confirm Carl's innocence gone. And then there was the keychain. Found in Carl's pants pocket, sealed in a Ziploc bag for preservation, was a dull metal key on a Mount View storage depot tag. Locker 119, a facility that had been shuttered and condemned 5 years ago, now standing as a crumbling monument to 1990s prefab construction. Sheriff Quinn arranged for access. The locker door groaned open like a haunted breath. Dust and cobwebs filled the space, but tucked inside, untouched and shielded from view, were 2 crates. In them, more bank bags, older model walkie-talkies, and perhaps most disturbingly, black and white surveillance photos printed on contact sheets. Each photo featured the same van, the same armored truck route, dated days before the heist. There was no question now. Someone had planned the robbery with care. And Carl, whether as a willing accomplice or an unwitting mule, had somehow ended up in the middle of it. As Sheriff Quinn stared at the old photos, a question settled like fog in her mind. What had Carl known? Had someone hidden the money under the bus before it crashed? Or worse, had Carl discovered it, tried to do the right thing, and paid for it with his life? The answer might lie in the one witness who had survived that ride. The boy who rode alone, Timmy Lasker. Now 35 and living under a different last name, Tim Lasker had never spoken to. The press never commented on Carl's disappearance. But when contacted by investigators, he didn't hang up. He said one sentence that stopped Quinn cold. "I remember more than I said back then." The knock at Tim Lasker's door came on a gray Thursday morning. He lived in a modest house on the outskirts of Columbia, Missouri, far from the narrow, unpaved roads of Pine Hollow. When he answered, his eyes flicked immediately to the badge in Sheriff Marta Quinn's hand. "You really came yourself," he said, stepping aside. "I figured you'd send someone." "I'm not letting this one pass down the line," Quinn replied. "Mind if we sit?" Tim gestured toward the kitchen, where a single mug sat beside a legal pad covered in notes. His life looked orderly, perhaps obsessively so. Folders stacked in perfect symmetry, the sink spotless. But something in his eyes was restless, a flicker of memory refusing to be buried. "You said you remembered more," Quinn began. "What changed?" Tim sat across from her, clasping his hands tightly. "I lied back then, to the police, to my mom, everyone. Why, I was scared, and I was 8. I didn't know what I'd seen or if I should tell it." Quinn leaned forward, her voice quiet. "Tell it now." Tim took a long breath. "That last ride with Carl, it was weird from the start. I was the only kid on the bus because I'd stayed late for library club. Everyone else had gone home hours earlier. It was just me and Mr. Decker. We were maybe 15 minutes into the route when he pulled over. Just stopped. on a dirt shoulder near the creek bend. Did he say why? Tim shook his head. No. He got out, said he'd be right back. I waited maybe 5 minutes. Then I heard something. Another car, I think. But I couldn't see out the window. Then voices, not yelling but urgent. Could you tell who? One of them might have been Carl. The other was deeper, rougher, older. It didn't sound like an argument, more like instructions. Then the back door of the bus opened. I ducked between the seats. Why? Instinct, I guess. Something about it didn't feel right. I saw boots. Muddy. Big ones. A guy climbed on. He had a duffel bag. Tossed it under one of the floor panels at the back. Then he left. A minute later, Carl got back on and just drove like nothing happened. Quinn's heart pounded. Why didn't you say anything before? Because that night before the news even said Carl was missing, a man came to our house. She froze. What? I don't know how he knew where I lived. But he knocked on the door and told my mom he was with the school board. Said he was just checking in on students after the mix-up with the bus. Said I must have been scared and offered me a toy truck as a peace offering. I never saw him again. Did your mom believe him? She thought it was weird, but she was tired, and I didn't say anything to contradict him. But I remember his face. I could draw it today. Quinn scribbled notes rapidly. There's one more thing, Tim added. Carl looked terrified when he got back on the bus. His hands were shaking. He kept glancing in the mirror like someone might be following us. Did he say anything to you? Tim hesitated. Just one thing. Right before I got off, he said, "Don't talk to strangers this weekend, Tim, especially ones who smile too much." That stuck with me. Quinn felt a chill creep up her spine. If Tim's memory was accurate, Carl had known he was in danger. He hadn't just vanished. He'd been caught in something bigger, something that left him scared enough to warn a child. Back at the sheriff's office, Quinn had Tim sit with a sketch artist. Within an hour, they had a composite, a heavy-set man, square jaw, deep-set eyes, receding hairline. The kind of face that could blend into any small town. She sent it to the FBI Archive Division for a cross-check with persons of interest from the 1992 robbery case. But it wasn't the sketch that broke the case open. It was a fingerprint. While combing through the rusted bus wreckage, a forensic tech had recovered a partial print on the plastic wrap of one of the cash bundles. With some digital enhancement and luck, it returned a hit. Name Roy Halberd. DOB 1953. Last known address, Amarillo, Texas, deceased 2019, ruled as heart failure in hospice care. Halberd had a sealed juvenile record, a stint in federal prison in the 70s for armed robbery, and had been questioned in multiple suspected trafficking cases in Oklahoma. Though never convicted beyond his early crime, the file noted a suspected connection to an unsolved 1992 armored truck robbery near Mountview. Quinn stared at the mugshot. It was the man Tim had described, so here was the likely accomplice. A man with a violent past. Now dead. But the pieces were falling into place. Halberd and Carl had crossed paths, how exactly remained unclear. Possibly through Carl's cousin at the depot. Possibly through someone else entirely. But it was clear Carl had either witnessed something, participated unwillingly, or attempted to bring the stolen money to someone who could report it. And someone made sure he and the money disappeared. The final clue came from an unlikely place. Among the rotted bus debris hidden beneath a warped metal strip under the rear floorboards, a small cassette tape had been wedged inside a maintenance panel. It had somehow survived. After careful cleaning, the forensic team was able to digitize it. The tape was short, muffled, but the audio was damning. Carl's voice panicked, whispering, "I didn't sign up for this. You said no one would get hurt. You said it was just a drop. Now there's blood. I'm going to the sheriff. I'm not living like this." There was a pause. Then another voice, gravelly measured. You go to the cops, and I'll make sure your wife's the one we fish out of that creek next. Carl's breathing quickens. Then silence. Sheriff Quinn sat motionless as the recording ended. Carl had been coerced, threatened, and ultimately silenced. He wasn't a thief. He was a man trying to do the right thing, and he paid for it with his life. The recording changed everything. Sheriff Quinn played it back 3 times that night, the static and hiss of old tape doing little to blunt the fear in Carl Decker's voice. There was no mistaking it. He had wanted out. Whatever arrangement he'd been drawn into, it had gone too far, and someone had made sure he didn't walk away from it. The implications of the tape spread fast. The state police reclassified the case from accidental disappearance to homicide linked to historical organized crime. The FBI officially reopened the file on the 1992 armored truck robbery. Carl was no longer a suspect. He was a victim. But what haunted Quinn more than the voice on the tape was the threat, "Your wife's the one we fish out of that creek next." Judith. Had she known? Had she been warned? Had she suspected all along? The next morning, Quinn drove back out to Judith's small rental house near the town's edge. The front porch sagged under the weight of old flower pots and wind chimes. Judith opened the door before Quinn could knock, eyes rimmed red from lack of sleep. "I heard," she said. "The tape." "I wanted to ask you something," Quinn said. "And I need you to think carefully." They sat at the kitchen table, same one that Carl used to eat dinner at every night before his late runs. "Did anyone ever come by after Carl vanished? Say anything strange, threaten you in any way?" Judith hesitated, then slowly nodded. "There was a man," she whispered. "About a week after they declared Carl missing. I was sitting on the porch. He pulled up in a gray truck. Got out like he was just going to ask for directions, but then he leaned in close. Said I should stop digging or I'd end up like my husband. Then he smiled and drove off." "Did you tell anyone?" Judith shook her head. "I didn't think they'd believe me. Everyone already thought Carl ran off with money or snapped. I was grieving. I didn't want people to say I was losing it too." Quinn made a note. "You remember what he looked like? Beard. Broken front tooth. Had a scar right here," she said, tracing a line below her left eye. Quinn's heart jumped. "Did you ever see him again?" "No. But after that, I never asked questions again. I shut up. I stayed home." The pieces clicked. The voice on the tape was likely Roy Halberd. But the man who came to intimidate Judith wasn't him. Which meant there was someone else, a third person. Someone local enough to know where Judith lived, bold enough to deliver threats in broad daylight, and quiet enough to have escaped suspicion for nearly 3 decades. She needed to go back to the beginning, back to the bus route, back to the scene of the vanishing. Quinn pulled the old rote logs from the school archives and followed the path Carl would have driven that October afternoon in 1996. It led through dense, wooded areas, gravel roads that twisted like coiled snakes, and past one crucial fork near a private property gate. It was easy to overlook, but that small turnoff could lead straight to the now dry Creekbed. A faded mailbox stood nearby H. Crandall. That name. Quinn returned to her office and searched through archived incident reports. Henry Crandall, local mechanic. Deceased as of 2003. Owned the land bordering the creekbed. No known family. But further digging revealed something else. Crandall had a son, Eli Crandall, born 1962. Known for a string of minor offenses, trespassing, bar fights, illegal firearm possession. Nothing that stuck. And his last known address, a trailer park just 15 miles from Pine Hollow. Sheriff Quinn called for a warrant. When they arrived at Eli Crandall's trailer, the man didn't answer the door. Deputies found him out back cleaning a shotgun. He didn't resist arrest. Barely said a word. But inside the trailer, buried in a file box beneath old tax forms and hunting permits, was a Polaroid photo Carl Decker standing next to Eli, both in work gear, both smiling stiffly in front of what looked like an early 90s pickup truck. Quinn set the photo down. Her gut twisted. They had known each other. Back at the station, under interrogation, Eli was calm, measured. We worked together at the shop, he admitted. He didn't say much, kept to himself. But I knew he was involved in something. Involved how Roy used to come around, talk to him outside. Carl didn't look happy about it. Did you help hide the bus? Eli didn't blink. I didn't push it in the creek. I just didn't stop it. But you threatened his wife. This time his eyes narrowed. I never touched her. Just wanted her to keep quiet. For her own good. And the money. I never saw a cent. Roy said it'd all be worth it, that we'd split it when things cooled down. But Carl never wanted in. I think he only agreed to help with one drop. Then he panicked. Quinn leaned forward. Did you kill him? Eli hesitated. No, he said finally. But I didn't stop it either. They charged him with conspiracy, intimidation, and obstruction of justice in a decades-old homicide. There was enough circumstantial evidence, enough testimony, and that photo. Eli would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Carl's name was finally cleared. A public ceremony was held that spring. The local school district dedicated a bench and plaque in his honor beneath the big oak tree behind the gymnasium where he used to park his bus. Judith attended, her hand resting gently on the plaque, as if finally letting go of a weight she had carried for half her life. And Tim Lasker, now far removed from the scared boy on that bus, stood behind the podium and spoke. He didn't run. He didn't steal. He tried to do the right thing. And for that, we owe him more than just an apology. For Pine Hollow, justice had come too late for Carl Decker, but not too late for the truth. Spring arrived in Pine Hollow with a strange hush that year. The trees bloomed as always. The air carried the smell of wet earth and daffodils. But under the surface, the town buzzed with unease. Carl Decker's name, once spoken with suspicion or discomfort, now drifted through households in conversations laced with regret. At the sheriff's office, Marta Quinn stared at the final case file. She'd written those 3 words herself for the first time in 27 years. Case closed. But something kept gnawing at her. Roy Halberd was dead. Eli Crandall was in custody, facing multiple charges. And yet the questions lingered. Chief among them, where had the money gone? From the armored truck robbery back in 1992, over $2.3 million had disappeared. FBI reports had confirmed roughly $300,000 was ever recovered. If the duffel bag in the bus wreck held anything, it had already been degraded by water and time. Only scattered bills remained, barely enough to piece together a few $100s. So where was the rest? Quinn reopened the sketch of Carl and Eli standing beside the pickup truck. Something in the background caught her eye. A wide hill, a specific split tree stump, maybe near the Crandall property. She got in her cruiser and drove back to the location herself. This time she brought a metal detector and the county's forensic archaeologist, Dr. Renee Barker, who had volunteered on the Decker case since the drainage pipe discovery. The Crandall property had long since grown wild roots, overtaking old fence posts, grass as high as Quinn's knees. But after 2 hours sweeping the backwoods near the creek bend, the metal detector began to ping. Barker dropped to her knees, brushing aside thick moss and sod. A few feet down, her fingers struck something firm, plastic sheeting. Minutes later, they uncovered a long, narrow case, military-style, sealed tight with bolts. It took time to pry it open. Inside, cash, bundles of it warped but intact, layered in plastic wrap with duct tape around each stack. There had to be over $100,000, and that was only the beginning. By nightfall, they'd uncovered 2 more containers. In total, over $480,000 was recovered from beneath the tree roots. And based on the deterioration of the plastic, it had likely been buried for decades. Back at the station, Quinn took a moment to process what this meant. Carl had indeed transported something, at least part of the stolen money, but not for himself. The recording proved he'd intended to tell authorities. So why bury it? The answer came in the form of an old note discovered in one of Carl's bus logs. Scribbled in the back margin in shaky handwriting, it read, "If you find this and I'm gone, it's not mine. Don't keep it. Tell Judith I tried to fix it. Sue." A confession of sorts, but also a plea. Carl had buried the money either to keep it out of the wrong hands or to force a reckoning he never got to witness. Quinn brought the money to the FBI. The bills were matched against serial logs from the 1992 armored truck job and officially seized as recovered evidence. News of the find spread statewide, but the biggest shift was felt in Pine Hollow. People began to speak about Carl differently. Kids who once whispered ghost stories about the missing bus driver now learned his real story in history class. Judith Long Reclusive was asked to speak at town hall. She declined, but she sent a letter. Carl was a quiet man, but he believed in doing the right thing even when it cost him everything. I hope that matters more now than it did when he vanished. There was only one person left to speak to an old name Quinn hadn't thought of since the early days of the case. Paul Renner, Carl's cousin, former maintenance supervisor for the school district. He had retired the same year Carl vanished and moved out west to a small ranch in Idaho. Quinn placed the call herself. Paul answered, his voice gravelly but steady. When she introduced herself, there was a long silence. "I figured this day would come," he said finally. "You know why I'm calling." "Because it's not over," Paul said. "Not really." "Did you help them?" Quinn asked flatly. "I didn't know at first. Not really. Carl just said he needed a place to stash something in case things went sideways. I thought it was tools, or maybe contraband from the shop. Never dreamed it was stolen money. But later, you figured it out." "Yeah. After he disappeared, I knew. But by then it was too late. Roy was still around then. And Eli, he made sure I kept quiet." Quinn took a breath. "So you did nothing." Paul sounded old, tired. "I kept quiet for Judith, for Carl's kid. I thought if I stayed out of it, they'd be safe. You understand that by staying silent, you let a murderer get away for decades." "I do," he said. "And I've lived with that every day since." Quinn paused. "Would you be willing to submit a statement for the record?" "Yes," Paul said quietly. "It's time." A week later, Paul's handwritten statement arrived. It confirmed Carl's original involvement as an unwilling participant in one of the drop points for the stolen money. He described how Carl confided in him, desperate to do the right thing. He'd helped bury one of the containers under a tree near the Crandall border. But after the confrontation with Halberd, Carl vanished, and Paul never spoke again. The truth was messy, but now it was recorded, filed, preserved, and finally told. Carl Decker had tried to stop a crime, tried to shield his family, and been buried along with the truth for 27 years. But the waters had receded, and in their wake, justice had finally found its way home. By midsummer, the story of Carl Decker had become more than a local legend. It captured regional headlines and even caught the interest of a national true crime podcast. Reporters swarmed Pine Hollow, news vans parked at odd angles along the sleepy town's main street. Locals who had once whispered about Carl's sudden snap were now speaking of him with something closer to reverence. But Sheriff Marta Quinn wasn't done. There was still one unanswered question in the file that kept her awake at night. What happened on that last day after Carl radioed in for his final check-in and before the bus went off the grid? The bus's GPS unit, primitive by today's standards, had only logged its last known position within a half-mile radius near Crandall's property. But a discovery came unexpectedly from an old janitor named Howard Wells, who had worked at Pine Hollow Elementary in the 90s. "I kept one of Carl's old radios," he said, walking into the sheriff's office with a dusty box under one arm. "Thought it was broken, but it still lights up." Inside the box was a handheld two-way transceiver, the same kind issued to district bus drivers. Most had been decommissioned and scrapped years ago, but this one had something lodged in its back, an old microcassette. Quinn called in a specialist to restore it. The playback was muffled, but one segment came through clearly. Crackling static. By the turnoff now. Eli's not here. Just Roy. He says there's been a change. He wants to long pause, wants me to move it tonight. I don't like this. He's not making sense. Something's wrong. Tell Judy. Tell her I love her. That was it. The tape clicked and hissed, then went silent. Move it tonight. Quinn consulted the old map. The route Roy had likely used to smuggle the money or coordinate the drops would have required access to private backroads, many of which cut through old mining trails. She cross-referenced the dates of known cartel movements in the area with old land records. One name came up again and again: Douglas Leary. Now in his 80s and living in a hospice home outside Branson, Leary had been a prominent land broker in the early 90s. He bought up parcels of land near Pine Hollow, flipped them quickly, and maintained informal trails across properties for equipment transfers. When Quinn visited him, he didn't recognize her at first. But once she said Carl Decker's name, his eyes sharpened. Bus driver, he muttered. Didn't deserve it. What do you remember? Quinn asked gently. Roy used to run deals through my trails. Paid in cash. Said it was just freight. Leary said, voice gravelly. But freight don't bleed. I saw what he did to that boy. Carl. What exactly did you see? They argued. Carl didn't want to drive anymore. Said he was done. Roy laughed, said he couldn't be done, not with that kind of knowledge. Then Roy, he pulled a gun. Quinn leaned forward. Did you see him pull the trigger? No. I walked away. Coward that I am. Heard shouting. Then nothing. Why didn't you come forward? They would have killed me too. And by the time Roy was gone, it didn't matter anymore. But it did matter. It filled in a final blank. Roy Halberd had murdered Carl Decker that night, whether by bullet force or coercion that led to the crash. It also painted Leary as a critical witness. With Leary's sworn statement and the evidence from the tape, the story was finally whole. The DOJ filed a historical indictment against Halberd posthumously for conspiracy and murder. It was symbolic there would be no trial, but it gave closure to those left behind. Quinn organized a closed-door meeting with Judith Decker, Tim Lasker, and a few other surviving figures from the case. In that room, under flickering fluorescent lights, she read the full narrative aloud, connecting every detail from Carl's last route to the money under the tree, to Roy's threats, to Eli Crandall's complicity, and finally, to Leary's long-withheld testimony. No one spoke for a long time afterward. Then Judith said Carl never gave up. Not once. Even when they had him backed into a corner. Tim nodded. He tried to protect us all. And we let people say the worst things about him. No more, Quinn said. This story, his story, is going on the record the right way. And it did. A month later, a full-length article was published in the Missouri Review of Law and Justice. Entitled, The Bus Driver Who Buried the Truth. It walked through every twist of the case. National outlets picked it up. A documentary was optioned. Carl's legacy was no longer that of a ghost. It was that of a protector. A man caught between justice and fear who chose to stand firm even when it cost him his life. As autumn returned to Pine Hollow, the bus bench at the school became a quiet memorial. Students, many of them children of those who once rode Carl's route, left drawings, thank you notes, and small yellow toy buses beside his plaque. For Marta Quinn, it marked the end of a chapter she never expected to inherit. But for Carl Decker, it was finally the end of silence. The leaves fell in amber waves across Pine Hollow as the town adjusted to the long-buried truth rising from the dirt. Yet Sheriff Marta Quinn knew one thread remained untied. A student, just a boy then, had once mentioned a ride that didn't feel right. His name had shown up years ago in Carl's old logs. Jacob Granger, age 11 in 1996. Now in his late 30s, Jacob lived in Kansas City, working as a field technician for a telecommunications company. He'd been hard to reach. No returned calls, no reply to emails. Finally, Quinn drove out herself. He opened the door cautiously, recognized her badge. His eyes narrowed. "You hear about Decker?" "I am." Jacob hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in." I figured this day would come. The living room was modest, cluttered with scattered tools and baby toys. He waved off Quinn's apology for the intrusion and offered coffee instead. When they finally sat, he didn't wait. I never forgot that ride. The Friday before Carl vanished, Quinn leaned forward. "Tell me everything." Jacob exhaled slowly. I was the last drop-off that day. Everyone else had already gotten off. I lived farther out Hickory Ridge down by the river. Carl had seemed distracted, nervous. He missed Jacob's usual stop, had to reverse halfway up the gravel shoulder. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. I asked if he was okay, Jacob recalled. He said, "Just tired sport, that's all." But there was something weird. Weird how, after I stepped off, I saw another truck. Black. No markings. Just parked at the crossroads. Carl pulled over to it. A man got out. Tall. Bald. I didn't recognize him, but he walked to the bus window and leaned in. They talked for maybe a minute. Did Carl seem scared? Jacob nodded. He did. The man handed him something looked like a bag. Carl took it. Then the truck turned around and drove off. He paused, his voice lower now. "I told my mom. She said I probably imagined it, that it was just a maintenance guy or something. But I know what I saw." Quinn scribbled notes furiously. "Could you identify the man if we showed you a lineup?" "I think so. Maybe." I still remember his walk. Kind of a limp in the left leg. Quinn's heart beat faster. Roy Halberd had broken his ankle in 1989, walked with a slight limp ever since. She retrieved an old DMV photo of Halberd from a folder in her bag. Jacob looked for less than 2 seconds before nodding. That's him. This was it. Confirmation from a witness. Another layer of proof that Carl's final ride had been under duress. That Halberd had orchestrated more than a cover-up. He'd made sure the last person who could expose him disappeared. But Jacob wasn't done. "There's one more thing." Quinn looked up. "About a week before that ride, Carl gave me a toy car. Just handed it to me when I got on the bus. Said it was for helping him carry a package the week before, something he needed to store in the seat compartment." Quinn frowned. "Do you still have it?" "I might. My mom kept a box of old stuff in the attic." 10 minutes later, Jacob returned with a dusty shoebox. Inside were faded drawings, a few action figures, and the toy car. Quinn picked it up. It was heavier than expected. She turned it over and saw the base had been unscrewed and reattached. She pried it gently open. Inside was a rolled-up slip of paper. Tiny, cramped handwriting. She unfolded it slowly. "They want me to drive another load soon. I told them I'm done. Roy says I'll regret it if I don't follow through. I'm scared for Judith. For Jacob, too. I hope this never has to be read. But if it is, please tell someone I never agreed to any of this. CD." Quinn stared at the note for a long time. There it was. Final proof. Carl had been coerced. He feared for his wife, for a child not even his own. And yet he had taken steps to document what was happening quietly, carefully, always protecting someone else. Jacob's eyes were wide. "He left that for me. He trusted you," Quinn said. "He thought you might be the only one to hold the truth long enough for it to matter." Back in Pine Hollow, the note was sealed in an evidence bag and submitted into the permanent record. Its contents were read aloud at Carl's official memorial service held at the high school auditorium. The entire town showed up. Judith sat front row. A school choir sang "Take Me Home Country Roads," Carl's favorite. And when the final line of the note was read, dozens of eyes welled with tears. Sheriff Quinn stood last at the podium. "We call Carl Decker's story a tragedy," she said. "But that's only part of it. His story is one of quiet courage, of silent resistance, of a man who did not lose his soul even when surrounded by those who had. A moment of silence followed, then an ovation. And outside, near the original bus yard, where Carl used to park each day, the town placed a bronze plaque. It read, "In honor of Carl Decker, 1948-1996 bus driver, husband, witness, hero, disappeared under threat, remembered with truth." With the letter in hand and witness testimony now solidly pointing to Roy Halberd as the architect of the crime, Sheriff Marta Quinn felt the weight of something long overdue slowly lifting. But questions still lingered, particularly about why Carl had been pulled into such a dangerous web in the first place. What was the load he had mentioned, and where had it gone? The cash found under the floorboards of the bus accounted for part of it, but something about Carl's wording hinted at something else, something he may have refused to move. Not just money. Quinn returned to the evidence locker and pulled the inventory log from the bus site. Among the items recovered was a small plastic baggie sealed with tape containing a tightly folded paper with only 2 lines. "North Gate, past the silo. It's still there." She froze. Could it be Eli Crandall? She drove back out to the old Crandall property, now seized by the state and gated off. Pasture land stretched wide and empty under the November sun, dotted with crumbling outbuildings and rusting farm equipment. With permission from the Attorney General's office, Quinn walked through the gate and made her way toward the disused grain silo. Behind it stood a wooden shed, half sunk into the ground. Inside, the air was thick with mold and rust. She scanned with her flashlight, nothing immediately visible. Then she spotted a trap door beneath an old tarp. It creaked loudly as she lifted it. Below was a shallow root cellar lined with concrete, and in the far corner, covered by a burlap sheet, were 6 large plastic bins. Industrial grade. Labeled only with black marker "Sample." Gloved and cautious, she peeled back the first lid. Inside were plastic-wrapped bricks, at least 50 pounds of an off-white substance. She didn't need a field kit to know what it was. Her call to the state drug enforcement team confirmed it. 2 hours later, unrefined heroin likely trafficked across the border in the early 90s. The kind of shipment that could ruin dozens of lives and fund dozens more. A deeper investigation revealed property records linking the land to an alias once used by Roy Halberd R.J. Keller. The trail was faint, built on shell corporations and blind trusts, but it was there. He'd been stockpiling illegal cargo using Carl as an unwitting mule until Carl refused. That refusal likely sealed his fate. It also meant that Halberd's operation was not a lone venture. He had help, possibly still active. Quinn called in the DEA and requested a quiet background sweep of Roy's old associates. One name jumped out: Victor Mendez, a retired logistics coordinator for a now-defunct shipping company based in St. Louis. Mendez had visited Pine Hollow twice in 1996 around the same time Carl disappeared. When agents questioned Mendez at his Florida residence, he refused to speak until presented with the evidence. Faced with a lifetime of secrets unraveling, Mendez flipped. He confirmed that Halberd and Crandall were part of a larger ring, one that used rural school routes to move contraband between staging areas. Carl was meant to deliver the heroin hidden in bins disguised as agricultural samples to a rendezvous point. When he backed out, Roy made sure the bus and Carl disappeared. And what of Eli Crandall? He had been murdered weeks after Carl's disappearance, supposedly over a debt. But Mendez confessed that Roy killed him to tie off loose ends. The last piece was chilling. Roy had been planning to pin the entire operation on Carl, using Crandall's testimony and the planted cash as proof. But when Carl refused and drove the wrong route, Roy pursued him through the back roads, forcing the bus off the path. Whether the bus crashed accidentally or Carl was already dead remains unclear. In either case, Roy buried the evidence and walked away. It took 27 years for it to surface. Sheriff Quinn returned to Pine Hollow as the first snow dusted the rooftops. The town had transformed over the course of the year from a place haunted by loss to one driven by truth. Carl's story had spread far beyond Missouri, becoming a feature in investigative journalism circles and drawing attention to other forgotten cases. And then something remarkable happened. One morning, a letter arrived at the sheriff's office. It was handwritten with a return address from northern Arizona. Inside was a note. I used to ride Carl's bus. I was 9. He gave me candy once when I was crying and sat with me until I got home. I never forgot him. Thank you for not giving up on him. Leah J. The letter moved Quinn to tears. It was never just about solving a case. It was about honoring a life. And Carl Decker, in all his quiet strength and sacrifice, had become more than a man lost in a creek bed. He had become a symbol for resilience, for decency, for the quiet courage it takes to say no when everyone else says yes. That spring, the town dedicated a new stretch of Highway 19 in his name, the Carl Decker Memorial Route. Students on their way to school passed the bronze road sign daily, and on that road, no one ever forgot again. Spring ushered in new beginnings for Pine Hollow. The past year had unearthed more than just a mystery. It had peeled back years of collective silence, guilt, and uncertainty that had blanketed the town since that foggy afternoon in 1996. Sheriff Marta Quinn stood by the newly unveiled Carl Decker Memorial Route sign, not as a symbol of authority, but as a guardian of memory. Her work was nearly done, but one last piece remained: speaking with Judith Decker. Judith had been gracious through every step of the investigation. When the bus was first pulled from the creek bed, she had come quietly wearing Carl's old jacket like a second skin. But closure didn't arrive with the evidence bags. It lived in the words left unsaid, the truths that had to be spoken aloud. Quinn knocked gently at Judith's porch. Judith opened the door, her features soft and aged, but her eyes still unwavering. She invited Marta in without hesitation. The living room was filled with photographs: Carl as a young man, the two of them on a beach, the bus yard covered in snow. "I figured you'd come," Judith said, settling into her armchair. "I wanted to bring you something," Marta replied. From her satchel, she produced a sealed envelope. Inside was the original note Carl had hidden in the toy car Jacob Granger had kept for decades. Judith opened it slowly, her fingers trembling. She read the note once, then again. Tears formed silently, tracking the corners of her face. "I knew," she said softly. "Not the details, but I knew he was scared. That last week he barely slept. I just didn't know what to do." "You did the best you could," Quinn said. "Carl tried to protect you, and now we can protect his name." Judith pressed the letter to her chest. He didn't deserve to be buried in silence. No, Quinn agreed. He deserved to be remembered. That weekend, the town organized a dedication ceremony at the Pine Hollow Community Center. Neighbors, former students, and families Carl had served gathered under a blue sky. A choir of local children, none of whom had ever known Carl personally, sang "You'll Never Walk Alone." When Judith spoke, her voice wavered but never broke. Carl Decker was not just a bus driver. He was a husband, a friend, a protector. He made hard choices so others wouldn't have to. And even when the world forgot him, he waited, quietly, until someone came looking. The crowd stood in silence. Then they applauded, not just for Carl, but for the decades of truth that finally came home. In the months that followed, Sheriff Quinn pushed the state legislature to open a task force dedicated to rural cold cases. Carl's investigation had highlighted just how easily cases in small, underfunded towns could slip through the cracks. Her proposal passed unanimously, and on the last day of her term as sheriff, she visited the tree by Slaughter Creek, where a child had once waited in vain. A new plaque stood there now, for Carl Decker. May no good man ever be lost again. Then she visited Judith, now living with her sister in a smaller home just outside of town. They shared coffee memories and quiet laughter. When she left, Judith handed her a small box. Inside was Carl's silver watch, water-damaged but still intact from the wreck. "You keep this," Judith said. "Let it remind you why you do what you do." Sheriff Marta Quinn would never forget, because some stories aren't just solved, they're carried forward. And Carl's, his legacy, his sacrifice, his refusal to be part of something evil would live far beyond a drainage ditch, far beyond the bus, and far beyond Pine Hollow. It would live in every child who got home safe, every truth that found its way to the surface, and every hand that refused to stay silent when it mattered most.